All right, and thanks to everyone for being here to listen to this pre-recorded talk on cognate complements in Barayin. I look forward to discussing any questions you may have at the end. I'll give a brief introduction to the kind of data we want to look at before giving some background on the language and where I got language data from. And then we'll jump into the topic of cognate complements and consider several possible ways of analyzing what they might mean, ruling out some possibilities, and focusing on one possible meaning that I think is the most likely. So by way of introduction, I first came across this particular pattern when doing elicitation in the language and asking basic questions about how do you say Musa is walking, how do you say Musa is running, and the structures I got back had the verb repeated twice in the sentence. So the first one there, Musa deji, Musa walk with an imperfective suffix on it, and then you get the verb walk again, but this time with this infinitival form. Same thing with the verb to run, Musa gore goro, first the imperfective followed by the infinitive. And when I first wrote about the language in my master's thesis in 2012, I mentioned this kind of a pattern, saying that in some intransitive clauses, you get this infinitival form of the verb following the conjugated verb, related them to what's elsewhere been called cognate complements or cognate objects. And I mentioned that the repetition of the verb could occur in different tenses or aspects, so it wasn't limited to the imperfective form. I also mentioned that there was no examples of this with objects, and I thought that the function was unknown, but maybe something related to focus on the verb. So now I'm coming back to try to sort of explore that initial sense that I had of the meaning without doing too much research to see what else we can learn about this structure. There are lots of works on cognate complements and similar things in Chadic. Three that I took inspiration from was Shu's work on Mia, Feisinger's work on Hidi, Helvig's on Gomai. And there isn't really, I think, an overview of this topic for Chadic languages, so I'm not going to try to do that overview, but I'll try to relate to bits and pieces of what's attested in other languages. So obviously, since we're in a Chadic workshop, we all know that Barayin is a Chadic language, part of the Afro-Asiatic phylum. Barayin is in the East Chadic group, in the B subgroup of languages spoken in the Gera region. So this is geopolitically within the country of Chad. It's a very diverse area linguistically. Just the Gera region where Barayin is spoken has about 25 different indigenous languages. A lot of this work early on came from consultants, especially Musa Adu with a lot of the elicitation work, but also Nasur Alias in later work. And a lot of my data that I'm using for this particular analysis comes from a language documentation corpus that was funded in 2017 by ELDP, where we were able to record a lot of hours of people just speaking naturally, mostly monologues, and have glossed enough of those that were annotated and translated to have a 25,000 word corpus. And then again, just to give credit for some of the people doing this work, like Usman Amin, they're speaking in white, who organized a lot of it. Some of the videographers like Mahmoud Pacha there and Mahmoud Isabuna, and then Sumain Dagash, who did most of the transcription and translation of this corpus. It's a Flex corpus, and so I'm able to search through it using Flex's interface to find different patterns. So what are cognate complements? So just to return to that form again, we have a primary verb that has some kind of inflection marker on it, a suffix. That's a tense aspect marker. And then that form is immediately followed by the identical verb root, but this time with an infinitival suffix instead of any other tense aspect marking. Just to give you an overview of how tense aspect marking works in Barayin verbs, all the verb roots are bound stems. They must take some kind of suffix. And when they are just taking a tense aspect suffix, which would be usually the first inflectional slot in the verbal morphology, they take one of these forms. So you see you have the imperfective and progressive forms, which are semantically quite closely related and patterns together in some ways in the syntax. Then you have a perfective or perfect form. Those are the four indicative forms. There's also a subjunctive and a hortative. And then in addition to those, there's a non-finite suffix, which is usually O. With some verbs, it's E. And there's only one of these non-finite suffixes. So it's not like in some languages any distinction between deverbal and participle or other ways of making non-finite verbs. There's one marker, and so this marker also changes the verb into something that functions like a noun in terms of its lexical category and what other morphology it can take after taking the infinitival suffix. I'll go through some possible interpretations of it and talk about some of the data as we go along. But first, we can point out that this is not an aspectual marker. So one reason for thinking it might be is because in a closely related language, Mawa, that Jim Roberts has been working on, he points out that there's a reduplicated form that does express progressive and imperfective aspect. So this is Mawa, and in Mawa this works because the main form of the verb has marking that's tense related, and so the reduplicated form comes in and brings a complementary aspectual meaning. But that's not the case in Barayin. Even in cases where we have this imperfective meaning or imperfective form, it's not necessarily imperfective. I mean, this sentence, her body turns white, is the translation of this imperfective form, so it's actually not an imperfective translation. That's because this is the imperfective form used in a narrative context. Um, this cognate complements can occur with all kinds of aspectual forms, so this is just an example of it occurring with the progressive. Kolo, he leaves. It can occur with the periphrastic future or deontic, and I haven't mentioned this form yet, but to talk about future or things that should happen, use this form, which is the preposition, which is kind of the default, most basic preposition, ing, followed by an infinitival form of the verb. So ting isuji is she will pour it, and then that's followed by an additional infinitival verb in the cognate complement form, and so that's possible here. Also possible in the subjunctive. So wokulo wokulo is here in a subjunctive because it's in a subordinate clause. The meat should be removed. It's possible in the hortative. We just have one example of this, but in doya, it would be the two of us, let's go to bed. And this case is followed by do Tybal. And then what really kind of shuts down any analysis of this as being imperfective or durative in some sense is examples like this. This is a perfect aspectual marking on the verb, and the translation is his mother died. So it's very much portrayed, and even in the story, as a punctual event. I don't think there's anything aspectual about this at all, and I don't really think the perfect marking in this language would be compatible with that kind of aspectual meaning. Um, there are, and in the citation, I did find examples of perfective verbs with this cognate complement. And there's a few examples in the corpus, although they're all a bit strange. And all of that points to the fact that even though I'm claiming here that the cognate complement itself doesn't have any special meaning, it actually does have a pattern to its distribution where it tends to co-occur more often with verbs in the imperfective or progressive form. So just looking at it by totals, by counts, by far the vast majority of cognate complements have the first verb in the imperfective form. I've tried to then look at how many verbs in total across the corpus use each of these forms. So the corpus is going to be biased towards imperfective forms because of the kinds of texts that are elicited. But even when accounting for the total numbers, there still is a statistically significant bias towards using cognate complements with imperfective and progressive. So cognate complements are found with all the tense aspect forms. There's not really indication of a common special meaning in the translations, at least that I could detect. But it's also not evenly distributed. So that's something I'll have to come back to. These cognate complements are not verbal plurality, and one reason for thinking might be is because, as Newman says in this overview, pluractionals are commonly indicated by reduplication. So we've already seen lots of examples of singular arguments and singular actions that are where cognate complements appear. There's one more example where it says he stops close by. The context of this example is very clear because it's a video elicitation where there's a single person doing a single action. There's no reason to pluralize it, and yet the cognate complement is used. There is a way to do verbal plurals in Barayin, and that's with the suffix ya, the palatal approximant, occurring next to the stem. So in the first example, wuro is insult, but wurio is the pluralized form. And what's interesting about these cases where you have verbal plurals and cognate complements like these two examples is that the cognate complement preserves the plural marking. So it's wurione wurio, not wurione wuro. The plural marking occurs both in the main verb and in the cognate complement. But I don't think the cognate complement itself expresses anything about plurality. The cognate complement is not an object, so you can compare this to things like in English, John died a gruesome death, or Harry lived an eventful life. So on the one hand, it's not like those kinds of things because um, it's an identical root. It's not just another noun that happens to have similar semantics, and it's not used in any kind of referential way, and it's not used to modify adverbally the action that's being described. So it's really not like these cognate objects at all. I had initially thought that or I had no examples initially of cognate complements occurring with object marking, but now having a larger corpus, I can look back and see that actually it's not common, but it is a regular occurrence to find examples of cognate complements with verbs that have an object marking suffix on them. So in this one, toki, itorang, itoro, if you count them, the first verb that's in the imperfective also has an object marker. This them refers to the years that are being counted in the context. So it's not referring to itoro as an object at all. So itoro is doing something else that's not object related. Another example of this, they made us come down, where us is the object marker, first person plural exclusive, in jingane, and then that's followed by a cognate complement that again is not self-co-referential with that object whatsoever. And there's also a few examples. This is less common, but a few examples where you have a full object noun phrase occurring with the cognate complement. So this one, degi di brusi, kill, imperfective, kill, infinitive, and then fish is the object. So obviously this deed is killing is not an object here. And then another possible interpretation is that's lexical aspect. And I don't think lexical aspect is the correct interpretation here, but I think there is some more research that can be done around lexical aspect to try to clarify what's happening here. And I'm mostly taking this idea from Helvig's work on Gomai, where she says that there is this cognate object construction in Gomai that's only attested with result verbs, and it derives activity expressions from result verbs. So it creates an activity expression that lacks temporal boundaries, creates expressions that behave like activity verbs. So if I've understood you right, essentially it's making TLIC activities into a TLIC activities. And this is a bit challenging to try to assess in a sort of corpus-based approach to studying the function of this form of cognate complements. There are some verbs that have several possible lexical aspects depending on which meaning of the verb is being used. So one of those is a verb like sulo. Sulo can mean sit or stay in a state of sense. It can also mean to live somewhere in a state of sense. But then it has this other meaning, sit down, which is more of an achievement meaning that has its telic end to it when you have completed sitting down. And the four cases of cognate complements with this verb all occur with this achievement meaning. And so you might think, okay, maybe that's related. However, there's other possible explanations, namely that these four cases of cognate complements all occur in the elicitation context that I mentioned earlier. So that's probably a better explanation for this pattern than anything else. And then you look at other verbs that have some more than one meaning. So the verb gomo, to fight, on its own, it would usually mean to hit, have the semifactive meaning, at least by default, making assumptions from sort of the English glosses or translations. But when it's used with a detransitivizing suffix that turns it into a reciprocal, it means to fight. So very similar to the French battre, se battre. And that's the context in which we see cognate complements, fighting versus hitting. But if we compare those two examples, we basically get with the one verb, sulo, we get the use of cognate complements when it's an achievement. And with the other verb, fight, we get the use of cognate complements when it's an activity. And if we're assuming some kind of Wendler-Comrie adapted lexical aspect diagram here, there's nothing in common with achievements and activities. So it's not at all obvious that these cognate complements pattern with a particular type of lexical aspect. But this is difficult to test, in one, because I don't know that much about lexical aspects of verbs, and in addition, because I'm looking at a corpus, it's hard to find enough examples of a cognate complement with a particular verb group to know how it's patterning. There are a few examples that suggest that looking at lexical aspect is going down the wrong path. And some of them are cases where a verb gets repeated. So in this example here, we get the verb wolo, to pass, to surpass, to exceed. something like that. In the sentence, ti wole no wolo, so we have a cognate complement wolo after the verb. And then that's repeated in this tailhead linkage kind of form in the next clause, ti wolone. And in the repetition, the cognate complement is not also repeated. And so in that context, the cognate complement is really treated as something optional or something that's not essential for the at least the true conditional semantics of this predicate, that the repetition drops the cognate complement. So that doesn't fit with, so at least in my mind, with analysis of this as lexical aspects, because you wouldn't repeat the verb with a different lexical aspect if you were trying to do this kind of tailhead linkage structure in the discourse. So another possible interpretation is that these things are actually about focus on the verb. And this is one thing that Mia points at. Now, these cognitive complements in Mia are quite complex, and there's actually more than one type of infinitival or more than one type of function. But I'll refer to some of Shu's ideas on why at least one of the functions of cognate complements in Mia might be focus related, and see how that relates to what's happening in Barayin. So he gives a number of reasons for why this might be some kind of focus, and points out that by definition, by repeating the verb root, we're talking about something inflecting the verb. He says it's reasonable to view cognate complements as verb focus in Mia. The Barayin context gives some ideas for why focus might be a good interpretation of at least some uses of cognate complements. And one of those is that there seems to be a disproportionate number of cognate complements in elicitation contexts. So like I mentioned at the very beginning, sitting down and asking, what is this verb? What is this verb? What is this verb? You can imagine giving somebody a list of different verbs and going through this pattern that you get into this sort of a mental or informational structure context of contrasting different verbal meanings, and very naturally are focusing on verbal meanings, which is why an elicitation pattern or that kind of interview setting might end up with structures that reflect verbal focus. And then it also happened in video elicitation, where I was showing videos of people doing different actions and contrasting action in different videos. And so again, that may very clearly give this context where it's the same person in the same chair and the same bowl, but the actions are differing. Well, that's a context where something like focus on the verb might arise. So that's one clue for why focus might be a good analysis. Ideally, you'd want to have cases of answering a question about the predicate, and I haven't elicited any of those, but looking through the corpus, I did find at least one example that suggested of a context where there is a question about the predicate. So the order here is inverse of what you would do probably in a elicitation session, but in the discourse, and this is a monologue, he's describing this context where he's talking about how I think hunters share their food, and so he says, "Ni kisinyo, do you share it?" Or, and it has this interrogative, and then follows it with another question, "Ni gangitan, how do you do it, or what do you do?" So this is a context where there seems to be the speaker is trying to raise a question about this predicate in the mind of the listeners, and that would coincide with a focus interpretation of the cognate complement that shows up in line 85 there. Shu says that cognate complements in Mia are rarely negated, and he relates that to focus by saying that normally a negation marker is attracting focus itself. There's only one example of a negated cognate complement in my corpus of the 80 or something examples of cognate complements that I have. And what's interesting about this example is that it actually seems to show contrasted focus. So you get this verb wokulo, to remove, with a repeated verb, wokulo wokulo, and then you get this verb slaughter, wolo, wole wolodo, with a repeated o. And the second one is negated. So he's saying you should do this is let me remove, but you shouldn't do is slaughter it. And so this creates this contrasted focus environment where you get cognate complements on both sides, and again seems to align with this analysis that these cognate complements might be signaling focus on the verb. However, there's other things that don't quite align with Shu's analysis of Mia. So in Mia, Shu says that cognate complements never occur with a question or focused noun phrase. And so this is one thing I did try to elicit over text, ask somebody, are these kinds of examples available? So I gave them a standard example like Musa Deidi and said, is it okay to say Ma Deidi? And I expected them to tell me that no, that's not okay, and was going to confirm my analysis, but actually they had no objection to the sentences made di non lote loto. So I take all of this data with a grain of salt. It's one person. It was just tested over text, but it doesn't confirm the analysis according to the way Shu is viewing these things. And there's another number of other things that Shu says. He says that cognate complements have recurrent relative clauses. I have 3 or 4 examples of that in my corpus for Barayin. He says that cognate complements are often used for states expressing a relationship between 2 arguments. That's not the case in Barayin. And he says that cognate complements are exclusive with a nominal object. Again, not the case in Barayin. So there's clearly some differences between Mia's analysis, Mia's cognate complements that may have some focus-related functions, and the Barayin cognate complements, which also seem to overlap in having a focus-related context where they occur, but they're not the same thing. They don't have the same syntactic profile or even necessarily information structure profile. So in conclusion, these cognate complements in Barayin are clearly not infinitival objects. They don't express TAM or plurality. They don't seem to correlate with any particular lexical aspect. So I think verbal focus is still the best hypothesis I have about their meaning. Going back to what I said about them many years ago and how I would say, how I describe them now, I said that the infinitival form of the verb often follows a conjugated verb. I don't think that's true at all now because I only found 80 examples of this in a corpus of over 6,000 different lines of text. I think it's still true that the repetition can occur in any tense or aspect, but there's clearly a preference that still needs to be accounted for where they tend to occur more in imperfective and progressive. I didn't think they could occur with object marking, but in fact they can occur with object marking and even occur with a full object noun phrase. The function is still relatively unknown, and I think what I first proposed many years ago, focus on the verb, is probably still the best path to explore. What we see in this analysis is clearly a limitation on using corpus data to test things like focus. Elicitation is going to be needed to try to really make some progress in understanding what cognate complements can and can't do in the language. And it's unclear whether the idea of these verbs as focus markers has any relationship to or would all explain the tendency for them to occur with imperfective and progressive. And I don't want to forget that there may be a multifunctional profile for cognate complements. So perhaps there's more than one thing happening, and I need to understand in which context does each use of cognate complements occur. So thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your discussion.